So why are we here? Why does the Heat Vision 2030 project exist? Well, because we're a group of firms in the sector that want to take action in the face of the climate crisis, and we want to help accelerate the role that zero carbon heat networks can play in the UK. Some basic context, I'm sure most of you will be aware of this sort of thing, but if we were to decarbonise heat completely in the UK, we would be taking about a third of the prevailing carbon emissions out of the UK's footprint. Meanwhile, the UK government's stated aim is to deliver about 20% of all heat from heat networks by 2050. The government has also stated that it wants to help cities reduce their carbon emissions by 70% by 2030. And this is at a time when cities across the UK have declared a climate crisis, many of whom are trying to target carbon neutrality by 2030 or some other type of serious action. And today, the heat delivered by heat networks still stands at about 2% of total heat delivered. So there's a lot of work to be done. Moment. So we're going to be asking you a few questions after we finish with the panel discussion and before we move on to answering your questions. And we'd really like to hear what you think about them. So just bear these questions in mind. If you have a look at them, should buildings in a heat network zone be obligated to either reduce the fossil fuel emissions or, if they prefer, join a heat network? In order to maximize the viability of heat networks, should all buildings in a zone be obligated to draw its heat from the heat network? To drive down fossil fuel emissions, should clean air zones be declared in all city centres? The climate change levy on gas already exists. Should the revenues be used to fund zero carbon solutions? And should buildings that join a low carbon heat network be exempt from paying the climate change levy? And do you think it is realistic to achieve net zero whilst allowing buildings to burn gas? Okay, that's enough from me. I'm going to pass over to Dave Pearson, who's going to sort of take us through the discussions itself. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Ben. I'm Dave Pearson of Star Refrigeration. I'm also director of Star Renewable Energy, our business segment that looks at large heat pumps. Got involved in this project turn of the year. Sat at home wondering what should we do, how can we move things forwards, and we started just trying to work out what the challenges were. District heating has been talked around for a long time, and we came up with the concept of, well, what would it take to do a heat network for Glasgow and the city centre, and how much would that cost in terms of the capital investment, and how much would that mean that the price of heat was from a district heating scheme in the centre of Glasgow, and how would we make that cost as low as possible over 60 years, and what are the barriers to making it happen? So quite a complex intertwined series of questions. Next slide, please, Ben. And we came across a company called Comsoft who have a modelling software, and we'll explain more about this as we go through. But basically, we picked the central area of Glasgow to the north of the river, and broadly speaking to the south of the M8 motorway as it crosses over the top. And I'll go into that in more detail, but basically using heat maps that are available, wondering just how much heat demand is there, and what if we use some of the heat pumps that we've delivered some 10 years ago now in Norway and in Zurich, and more recently in Queen's Quay at Clydebank. What if we use them to draw a tiny fraction of the heat that passes through in the river? What would that look like? Next slide, please, Ben. We broadened out, we listened to some of the other activities going on in the centre of Glasgow, your city, our city, for example, and one of their comments was, well, actually, your zone wasn't quite complete, take it slightly further north. And we worked this out, and you can see the tally on the amount of heat that would be needed for all the buildings there. Obviously coming from heat maps, slightly subjective data, but as I understand, Paul Steen said this to me first, the further out you zoom, the more accurate the data gets. So roughly speaking, it's about, I think that tallies around about 50 megawatts of heat demand for the centre of Glasgow as a peak. Next slide, please. And so the question, obviously, most people start with was, is it possible to take heat out the river? And these are some very recent slides from the plant down at Queen's Quay. We are now drawing heat from the River Clyde and delivering it to the new heat network for West of Bartonshire Council with Vital Energy, and delivering heat to some of the buildings down there. So the short answer is yes, let's talk about the more interesting and hard bits, heat pumps. And as a heat pump geek, I'm happy to say this, they're a bit boring and not really what the focus of conversation should be. It's all about how do we create a market for district heating to deliver clean heat. Next slide, please. So is it investable, and what analysis inputs are there? So one of the key things we really focused on quite early was about offtake surety. We had to have better costings and make them more granular, and what other stakeholders are involved. For example, the Our City project I mentioned, but also Strathclyde-led carbon neutral Glasgow City Innovation District that Roddy Yar can say some more on later on. But these are all aiming in the same sort of space. And we asked ourselves what sort of inputs. Well, 60 years seems reasonable. You know, the mission is 100% uptake, so why not aim for that? Quite clearly, in any society, we don't want subsidies for particular aspects once markets get moving. Quite clearly, we have to think about what level of IRR is acceptable. And so the analysis came back and said there were 1,341 buildings in the centre of Glasgow, and that's a mix of domestic apartment blocks and commercial, although largely commercial. And then, of course, one of the key inputs for any heat pump is what price of electricity is being paid. And should we model this based on 10 pence per kilowatt hour or private wire rate at 4.5 pence? And it became apparent from the analysis later that this is quite a challenging aspect. Next slide, please, Ben. So broad push through this, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it basically came down to some fairly chunky numbers. We put in costs for all the different aspects, and this is what the ComSoft software lets us do by defining heat demand and price of pipe work, etc., etc. It automatically models the most cost-effective route that can be taken, and then tallies that up as a bill of materials of how many sizes of each particular pipe. The next slide, please, Ben. And gives us a total takeaway of 140 gigawatt hours of heat annually, a price of heat likely to be between 6 pence and 10 pence per kilowatt hour, capex of 250 million, and opex, which is principally the electrical cost plus some maintenance of 250 million, but with revenue annually of 750 million to achieve 31,500 tons of carbon dioxide. And of course, as I said earlier, based on 100% offtake. So very quickly, you can see there's some big wins in terms of carbon saving, air quality aspect as well, and job creation. Quite clearly, there's going to have to be a collective spirit, so very much in the spirit of commonweal. Next slide, please. So conclusion, yes, it can start. We know how to do this. It's been done before in other cities. Some early work that could begin would be making the surveys of the roads. Recent work around Strathclyde's district heating scheme showed that some of the data existed in the utilities mapping needed updating, and even with surveying, it's quite a complex city. It's got a very long history. The price of heat quite clearly is quite challenging. Maximum offtake, quite clearly you don't make it cheaper by having half the buildings not consuming, and it's really important for the optimum route. And quite clearly all of that is driven by strong regulation, and that really took us to the most recent part of saying, if we're going to make this happen, what rules do we need to drive the uptake and connection of heat. And I think that's the last slide, Ben. Sorry, one more. So quite a few big unknowns though, and we've done this process a couple of times, and really every time said, well, what else don't we know? Or somebody came along, like some of the audience today might say, well, that's all very nice, guys, but you didn't consider this, and we take extra input back into this. So some big unknowns about future heat loads. Obviously, cities are changing quite dramatically, obviously, in the last few months. Price of electricity locally, real data. Heat maps are all very good, but actually, what about actual billing data? Who holds the billing data for these particular facilities? And what additional benefits can district heating deliver? Air quality being a big part. And if a government is going to spend a significant portion of the deployment, is that actually all cost, or is there some value to be had? What is the value of spending £1 in a city on a capital project? So quite clearly some aspects from government that aren't within our gift. And big challenges, clearly private funding is part of it, a heat price as close to gas as possible. End users have lots of choices. Legislation is a key bit. Time scale, 70% by 2030, the Scottish Heat Network programme is calling for. And digging up roads is highly complex and expensive. So huge challenges. So how do we make it easier? What can we change? What can't we change? And how do we create the policy landscape where investment can arrive? Finance is a fairly simple topic. You can borrow money for anything so long as you promise and are convincing enough that you'll give it back. So how do we make this investable? So that's the run through of the work to date. We've proven what we kind of knew, which is this is really difficult. That doesn't mean that we can just say, oh, well, let's not bother. So we've got some guides today to help us through a couple of different aspects of this. If we could all jump on just now, that would be great.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, brilliant. Thanks, everyone. We think that we have Chris Small as well. Can you let us know if you're there, Chris?
Hi, Ben. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can hear you just great, Chris. Thanks very much. So I'm going to invite Roddy to talk first, then Paul, and then I'll let Rufus, Amy, and finish off with Chris in terms of intros. But I'll prompt you guys. Okay, thanks, and welcome to Roddy Yar.
Thanks, Ben. Good to be here. So I'm Roddy Yar. I work at the University of Strathclyde. I'm the operational lead for our net zero emissions pathway work, which Dave mentioned briefly. So we're keen to be part of this, and we are doing our bit to collaborate with others in the city to try and make this kind of radical change agenda happen. Obviously, the university, like many in Scotland, have our own net zero targets, as does Glasgow City Council and lots of other local authority partners that we work in. So we're keen to be I guess a neutral but deeply interested facilitator of change here, because that's what's needed. So we've been working on decentralised heat for a number of years. With the help of funding from Scottish Funding Council, we recently installed a 27.3 megawatt heat network that serves 18 buildings in the city centre of Glasgow. So I know what it's like to dig up the streets. I worked with our construction partners and design teams on that, and it can be done. That's the good news. We can do this. However, it's a gas-fired network, and we need to move away from that. So we're very interested in helping to facilitate change, as I said, and we're leading a piece of work which Dave and others and partners are a part of in the Innovation District, which is right in the heart of Glasgow City, which also happens to be an LHES, a local heat and energy efficiency strategy priority 1 area. So working in partnership with Glasgow City Council and putting our own investment into this piece of work, a technical piece of work that will bring forward a whole systems approach. And we think a whole systems approach is the way forward, an important part of this. So I won't say any more. I'll pass on to others and hopefully contribute as we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roddy. I'll pass on to Paul.
Thanks very much, Ben. Thanks, Roddy. Yes, so I head up Rambol's district energy team in the UK. So Rambol's 16,000 employees worldwide. 1,500 of those are in our energy business, and I head up the team in the UK that's looking at energy systems. There's 27 of us with a significant focus on district heating, and that's where our history and heritage has been. But we've been looking more widely at the whole energy system transition, as Roddy was talking about, and developing that competence on the heat side to be able to understand and set priorities around the strategic vision for energy system decarbonisation for cities. And I've shared a slide here which just shows in sort of 3 segments how we see that process working, where there's on the left hand side there's a strategic context that sets the vision for decarbonisation, which is about understanding the status quo, the mapping, and a lot of the work that Dave was talking about that Consof has done, and that can set some measurable and verifiable project indicators and targets. In the middle, in order to deliver that strategy, we need a set of institutions and frameworks, and I think we'll touch on this in the conversation later around the organisations that need to be involved and how they're established and governed. And finally, we need a series of individual tactical projects, very much like the projects that Roddy was talking about, to begin to deliver that vision. But you need to keep the link back to the overall strategic context to make sure that they are all aligned and connected. The graph at the bottom was a bit of work I did. I was looking at over the weekend. We've just been looking at the cost of a typical gas bill, and I think we'll touch on this later as well, but I thought this was useful context to share now. Gas bills in the UK, clearly we commonly come across this as a challenge in terms of the counterfactual. And what's interesting in the analysis we've done recently is how small the environmental obligation contribution is in a typical gas bill, and how low the tax is. So we've got a VAT exemption on a domestic gas bill down to 5%. So there's a very low cost of gas. But if we look at these trajectories, this is the historical trajectory of how much environmental obligation has come in from gas. And back in the late 80s, there was a gas a cost, an environmental obligation applied to gas. I didn't know about it. I never paid gas bills back then, but I didn't realize it existed. It came out at the end of the 80s in 89, and has never come back since. But you can see what that red line is, the cost that has been contributed through renewable obligation over the years, and the yellow line is the contribution that renewable generation offers in the mix, and there's clearly a connection between those two. So we pay no environmental obligation for gas. We've been paying huge environmental obligations for electricity, and lo and behold, electricity is decarbonising and heat isn't. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you very much, Paul. Please, Rufus.
Hi everybody, I'm Rufus Ford from Vattenfall Heat UK. Just a quick introduction to Vattenfall. We're a Swedish state-owned utility with a mission to enable fossil fuel-free living within one generation, as we put it, but essentially aligns pretty much with net zero ambitions. We've been in the UK for a little over 10 years, mainly building wind farms, and then a couple of years ago in 2018, we launched some new businesses, one of which is the heat networks business that I work in. And we're set up to develop, finance, own and operate low carbon district heating infrastructure at scale. And we see that as one of the key tools available for decarbonising cities. So very much in line with the Heat 2030 vision. And with the focus on low carbon, the main heat sources we would expect to be using are heat offtake from energy from waste plants, and also heat pumps using various sources of environmental and waste heat. So since we launched a couple of years ago, we've announced a few projects, and they include Brent Cross South in London, serving about 6,500 homes with low carbon heat from heat pumps. A joint venture with Midlothian Council, taking heat from an energy recovery facility there, and supplying initially to local loads in that area, but with a longer term ambition to extend that pipe towards Edinburgh, and develop a kind of strategic scale heat network. And then we've also announced a couple of interesting examples of working with people who have sources of low carbon heat to develop heat networks. So sort of interesting approach of teaming up with the people that have the heat. And one of those is a partnership with Gorey Riverside Energy in East London. So again, energy from waste plant operator looking to take their heat and develop a large heat network in East London. And the other one, just a week or two ago, we announced a collaboration with Viridor, looking at opportunities to take heat from their fleet of energy recovery facilities around the UK and develop heat network projects off the back of those. So all of those projects are designed to achieve clean heats in UK cities, per the title of the webinar. So we very much support the aims of Heat Vision 2030 and look forward to discussing it further through the afternoon.
Many thanks, Rufus. Great stuff. Yes, Amy Ritchie from the Association of Decentralised Energy.
Hi, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I'm Amy Ritchie and I work in the External Affairs team at the Association for Decentralised Energy, or the ADE. So we are the leading trade association for decentralised energy in the UK. We're quite a small team, but we represent over 160 companies across the industrial, commercial and public sectors. Our vision is for a low carbon energy system that is based around the needs of the user. So we don't advocate for one specific technology type or kind of silver bullet solutions, but rather for contextual solutions that meet that aim of serving the user. So we work to create a strong, dynamic and sustainable policy and market environment where these technologies can thrive. And our members work primarily across combined heat and power, demand side response, energy efficiency, and of course, heat networks, who make up the largest proportion of our membership at the moment. So our engagement with government on the heat networks or in the heat network space has led to the establishment of quite a few different policies and sector support initiatives. So over the past year, we have overseen the launch of the Heat Networks Industry Council. And this is a group of major companies who are investing and delivering heat networks in the UK. And it kind of builds on the model of the Offshore Wind Industry Council that was very successful a couple of years ago. And it aims to escalate the level of engagement that the heat network sector has with government through presenting a kind of clear ask and offer on what heat networks can deliver in the UK, but also what we need to be able to do that. And currently the ADE are secretariat for the council, so we're looking forward to that kind of ramping up in the next year or so. Also this year, we launched a report in summer that detailed proposals for a national heat decarbonisation and energy efficiency zoning framework. This report looked at how such a framework could speed up the deployment of place-based solutions in the UK and allow areas and localities that are kind of ready to decarbonise and ready to look at heat network connections and deployment of low carbon energy infrastructure, get them going and get those in the ground, so to speak. And we're really pleased that BEIS actually took up some of those recommendations and announced that they will be consulting on zoning for heat networks from spring 2021. In Scotland specifically, over the past year and a half, we've had quite a big hand in the development of the Heat Networks Scotland Bill. So we've sat on the Heat Networks Regulation Working Group, looking at around issues specifically to do with obligation to connect and demand assurance. So we're really pleased to see that bill going front in Parliament earlier this year, and obviously hoping that the bill will be passed in spring 21. So that's kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the initiatives that we're involved in the heat network sector. Really excited to be here today. The Heat Vision 2030 project is actually shortlisted for one of our Decentralised Energy Awards, which will be announced next year. So I think it's a great example of what could be achieved through kind of cross-sector collaboration and deployment of really innovative technology. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Amy. I appreciate that. Now, Chris, can you hear us?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just great. Thanks, Chris. On you go.
Cool. Sorry, I could not get the tech to work, but yeah, hopefully you can hear me. So, hi everyone. I'm Chris Moore. I head up our project delivery team within the South of the UK, within the Heat Network Delivery Unit, or HNDU, within Phase. I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with what we do, but we provide funding to local authorities, works with probably over half to 2/3 of those across England and Wales to date. And increasingly find ourselves kind of working more directly with industry, the industry council, AD consultants, and also the partners here today to look at how we kind of tackle this sort of stuff on the ground, including things like zoning. Just a bit about me. So I've been working on Heat Network projects for a while now. I've been in HNDU on and off for about 5 years, and was doing some local authority Heat Network projects before that. And I've probably been fortunate to engage with well over kind of 50 to 100 projects at some point over the last few years, and so kind of got some experience of kind of what's worked well and what hasn't worked so well in England and Wales. Just kind of a couple of reflections rather than kind of repeating what we've already said about kind of policy and funding. So I guess, yeah, just a couple of reflections over the last couple of years from a project delivery side. The first one is we've noticed a huge shift predominantly away from kind of CHP, gas CHP projects to predominantly kind of heat pump or EFW projects, some kind of industrial offtake, but there's been a huge shift over the last kind of 12 to 18 months. Second thing is a kind of switch in emphasis from looking at kind of doing an analysis of heat networks versus gas to framing heat networks in the light of, you know, what is the cheapest way to achieve heat decarbonisation. And so those two things are kind of very different questions and open up a variety of new kind of opportunities. And the third one is the ability to kind of use new data, digital tools such as what's being done here in Heat Vision 2030, kind of help us understand the strategic context and enable us to kind of coordinate at a city level. So rather than just looking at kind of project level of 10 to 20 buildings at a time, how do we use heat networks to decarbonise cities? So yeah, undoubtedly a number of challenges, but yeah, I think it's important to kind of recognise where we come from. Some things have changed, and there's certainly a number of opportunities that we can take hold of.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's really good to hear from you as well. Stay on the line. Okay, well, listen, I'm going to pass over to Dave now and sort of take these points and yeah, see where we go.
Okay, thanks everyone. And the interesting bit for me is I get to help assemble a bunch of clever folk and then ask them tricky questions and sit back and listen, which is all very low stress. So I'm looking forward to this. But sticking back with Chris, first of all, and a really simple one, and these questions are all in the context of pretty much 100% decarbonisation by 2050 within the UK, and specifically the city centre areas. That's the sort of field of thinking that we're thinking about for the next 40 minutes or so. But Chris, taking that 2050 goal of 100%, how far do we have to get along that by 2030 to really have a good fighting chance of making that end piece?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave. So I think most people will probably be familiar with the 2% figure. So currently, about 2% of heat is supplied in 2020 via heat networks, and most of our kind of strategic central documents and also the CCC reports state that 18% could be supplied by heat networks by 2050. In terms of where we are now and where we need to get to, so I think at the moment it's fair to say there is and there has been some steady growth over the last few years, in part fueled by government funding, net zero, climate change targets, etc., etc. Some of those being 2030, not 2050, and I'm sure kind of, you know, you can look at the HNIP and LCITP pipelines to see some of those. However, as I'm sure you'll all be familiar, you know, that's the current trajectory is not going to get us to 18%. That's not to say that we expect there to kind of be a linear trajectory, but we are aware that we need to increase that trajectory over time. I think some of that is at the moment is currently driven by some kind of existing policies. We've already kind of mentioned the appetite, if you like, for low carbon heat specifically today, and the historic kind of way that Paul was touching on, you know, how heat works and how subsidies and kind of different environmental obligations have been placed. So that's not going to change, overnight. In terms of 2030 target, again, creates a bit of a challenge for us, an interesting challenge and a kind of useful challenge as well, in terms of on the ground delivery. In terms of a UK-wide level, you know, we still have some big kind of strategic decisions that we need to make in the mid-2020s around hydrogen and electrification. However, that should definitely not stop us from kind of delivering heat networks on the ground. So the key thing that I always refer to is, you know, identifying no or low regrets heat network solutions, and that means kind of identifying the areas where we can get cracking in the 2020s ahead of those kind of strategic decisions that are to come later down the line.
Okay, so success is still ahead of us, I think, is a fair way of summarising that. Lots to do. Turning to Roddy and Paul, I mean, there's obviously been quite a bit of success so far, but what's driven that? What have been the key policy levers and drivers for the networks that we've seen so far? Either of you first, just jump in.
I'll let Paul answer that first of all, I think.
Okay, all right. Well, first I'll say I think there's one other thing that that Chris mentioned in his list of things that's relevant to this point. He was talking about a number of shifts. The other shift I've seen, and certainly driven by UK and Scottish governments, is the shift to a larger scale emphasis. So a few years ago, the emphasis of projects was much smaller, was much more discrete projects. There's definitely been a shift to that bigger vision, that idea of looking at a city as a whole rather than looking at individual bits of it, and that leads me on to kind of the, you know, the challenges around the policy that you asked about, Dave. So there's a real complex picture that a city has to grapple with in terms of understanding all of the myriad issues around planning. So heat planning is only one part of the picture. An authority, and you have to admire people in authorities who can understand those competing priorities and trying to align them. But you've got a local development plan, you've got a transport strategy, you've got a clean air strategy, you've got your own estate and your housing strategy, and lots of other things. And all of those have a heat element in them. And you've got to try and manage all of that. And then you've got outside of that, and outside of the local authority's control, you've got a distribution and a transmission network that have got their own timescales and their own strategic plans and their own funding mechanisms. So there's a real complexity around all of that alignment. We can't change the timescales, we can't change the way that works, but we do have to navigate all of that. And I think what we're doing is getting better at learning how to navigate all those things and recognizing the role that heat plays. So I think there's a lot of positive there. And I think it's moving in the right direction. And I think the discussion now on looking at zoning has a real support to trying to understand all of those strategic issues, because you can start to look at a city and then break it down into its sort of jigsaw piece puzzles and then try and solve the issues more locally, but keep the connection between those zones and understand how they all work together.
So Roddy, thinking about the stuff that's happened well so far, what made that happen, and how do we utilize the same sort of levers, maybe in a slightly different format going forwards? Paul's mentioned planning, but clearly that doesn't apply to existing buildings.
No, I think obviously there's a technical challenge of getting our legacy estate into a position that can accept low carbon heat. In that sense, and that's a big piece of work that certainly we're all conscious of the need to focus on. That's not the glamorous kind of new build stuff. That's what we've got already, and we need to make it more efficient and take a fabric first approach. Refurbishment is going to be key in that respect. And enabling that to happen quickly is something that the heat decarbonisation policy needs to think about, and that applies to domestic as well as as non-domestic, and that's something that we're very conscious of. But I think Paul mentioned something about planning there, and I think that, you know, there's a radical shift needed here, isn't there, in city thinking. I'm very conscious that there are a lot of plans going on in Glasgow, which is where our university base is mainly centred. So that's why we think a whole systems approach is key, to collect up that narrative and all of those plans and developments and join them together as best we can. Dig once kind of mantra applies here, and I think, you know, things like the whole system approach, taking account of 100% heat, power, transport, climate adaptation, green infrastructure and communities, because this is about people, it's about heat, it's about power, it's about well-being. I think that's what we're trying to do in the climate neutral innovation district, is bring all that together, but we need to get that thinking into every member of the delivery community in Glasgow and in the region. I think that's what's really important point. We need to integrate this thinking that your team is coming up with into existing plans. So the infrastructure plans that Glasgow has got, for instance, the urban realm projects such as the City Deal Avenues, which is going to layer much needed and fantastic improvements across the streetscape, needs to think about what conduits it can create to enable district heating to penetrate at scale and at speed. And I think the last point I would make on this is that we need to do the demonstrator. We need to invest in what is deliverable so that it becomes, you know, almost a demonstration of what we need to do. And that takes very brave thinking and political will to make it happen. But I think we can bring the vision, but we need to demonstrate it. And I applaud the work that Sustainable Glasgow is doing, because they're trying to bring all this together. And I think that task force approach that enables a city like Glasgow to really deliver on this, but it's going to take vision, political will, and folk like yourselves, you know, causing these interventions and making us all think in a different way.
Okay, so the two themes so far that are kind of building up a wee bit. One is that it's about the existing buildings, and the second is that this is going to, you know, require significant investment. So a question for Rufus mainly, and Paul as well, if he's got some thoughts on it. But you can't sell something if there isn't a demand for it. So if we know that we need cleaner heat, but everybody's got an old building that's already got gas, which is a very, very functional fuel with very few problems in a traditional sense, but we recognize the carbon emissions from that and the air quality emissions. How do we drive a demand for clean heat in existing buildings? What makes that happen for buildings? You can't use the planning rules because the building's already built.
So, I mean, yeah, I think there's a bit of a carrot and stick approach probably needed, and I think it's worth saying there is some demand for clean heat already. It's not true to say there's none. So, and I think part of it is having that sort of vision and narrative. So the cities that are declaring climate emergencies, you know, all that kind of thing that's happening, is then encouraging particularly commercial organisations in those cities to sort of, you know, come along and you know, also they'll be driven by their own targets and so on. So you know, I think and I also think you know, over the past few years heat has become more recognised as an issue in terms of carbon emissions and so on, so there's more sort of familiarity with the need to decarbonise heating systems. So I think you know, there is some market pull. Obviously we need more to achieve the kind of targets that we're talking about. I think there's certainly you know, there's probably a bit of a phased approach. Obviously, you could imagine a bit more of an element of compulsion on, for example, public sector anchor loads initially, and sort of move into other sectors. I think commercial buildings will be easier than obviously sort of private housing, probably. I think there's things we can do with funding and capital support, so targeting that at buildings. You know, we can bring funding for heat networks, we can do deals with heat sources. And actually, so you know, maybe the sort of funding effort should be targeted at building owners and encouraging them to connect sooner rather than later. and that links very much to the zoning question of where you identify areas where heat networks are going to make sense, and then you target the buildings in those areas. And obviously, coupled with that, there's sort of things you can do in terms of consumer protection, technical standards, and so on to sort of make sure that the service is good. And heat networks do have advantages as well. That service provision sort of proposition, so that you're not going to have a shock when your boiler dies, and you're going to have that sort of guarantee of heat, guarantee of usually engineer call outs if there's any fault, all that kind of stuff. So I think there is a good story to tell there, and I think it's about sort of aligning the incentives to put it all in the right direction.
Paul, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think existing building owners within the realm of a heat network proposal, they need to see the route map. They need to see the future, and I think that goes back to the kind of conversation we had around strategy and the concept of having zones and having clarity around where this strategy is going. If organisations know what's coming, they can plan for what's coming. I think one of the challenges at the moment is the strategy not evolved to a point where there is that real clarity of purpose and delivery of the solutions. But once organisations, as Rufus said, know what's coming, they can then start to put that into their strategic planning, and they can say, right, we know that in this building, my boiler is going to come to the end of its life, and therefore I can plan for something in the future. And I can plan to make my connection at that point, and I can make a business case for it, and I can justify on the basis that I'm going to get something better than I've got already, and better is going to be dependent on their own individual perspectives. But one would hope that part of better is about being low carbon. And I think so that kind of brings us to the point on this obligation to connection and the carrot and stick bit. I mean, if we put our rose tinted glasses on, everyone says, I want a heat network connection. We're a long way from that. And first and foremost, we need people to know what heat networks are, and they need to see the benefits. So there are huge benefits, and that's another thing that the strategy can start to do. It can start to convey those benefits to people. So yeah, I think the idea of obligation to connect needs to be proportional. I would say, I mean, I don't think it's a solution itself. I think the conversation that Amy can contribute to around obligation to connect and the conversations that have been happening on that, I think would be useful. But my view is, it could create a rod for our own back if that is not done proportionally.
Well, that's an interesting comment. I was thinking, Amy, in terms of the work that the ADE have done in terms of the heat trust for more domestic consumers, but presumably commercial consumers have hopes and fears and aspirations. What do you think they look like going forwards? What do you think the customers are going to be asking for?
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of what consumers want from heat, I think the asks are kind of similar across the board. Consumers, especially domestic consumers, they want their heat systems to be simple, reliable. They want warmth and comfort, and they want it to make sense in terms of price. And we know that when low carbon heat and heat networks are coupled with retrofit of energy efficiency solutions and that kind of regulatory framework that doesn't cost the sector or consumers the earth, that heat networks can deliver that. And to build on what Paul and Rufus said, I think we would definitely say that we should utilize kind of trigger points as to, if there's a breakdown in existing heating systems, or there's changing tenures or changing home ownership, then those are the points where we should be saying to homeowners or commercial building owners, this is a great chance for you to look at changing your system and getting those low carbon systems in place. I think non-domestic consumers, particularly public sector, may have additional needs around climate targets and strategies that they have in place and the things that they would need their heat systems to meet. But yeah, broadly similar. And I think, to build on what Paul was saying, for a lot of us, especially us as panelists, and I'm sure a lot of people listening, we tend to get quite sort of bogged down in the nitty-gritty of heat network policy, but actually a lot of people in the UK still are not completely aware of what heat networks are, and they're not as, widely in place as they are in places like Scandinavia, where, heat networks are just the norm. So I think kind of preaching about those wider benefits is really important. And I know Ben talked about in a previous Heat Vision webinar that public engagement and kind of stakeholder buy-in are still barriers to deployment. So it's better to get people on board now and take them with us rather than forcing them to do it further down the line, and creating that positive narrative. And in terms, to come back to your point on Heat Trust, Dave, they found that a lot of dissatisfaction from heat network customers comes about when people move into a building, or that they're on a building and they don't realize when they move in that they're on a heat network. So they don't know how to engage with it fully. And if we kind of do that consumer awareness piece now, it's going to make lives easier further in the line.
Okay. Obviously, the underlying thing in all of this is about cost, and with everything in life, there's different flavors of that. And the question really sort of aiming towards Chris and Rufus, but how do you make the cost of a heat network as low as possible within certain quality parameters, and certain qualities of outcome? If it's all about low carbon and low emissions, but where do we see the opportunity for getting the best possible deployment for heat networks in terms of price certainty?
So one key thing is probably scale. So being able to develop a kind of wide area network will help in terms of economies of scale, and also tapping into low carbon and potentially more cost effective sources of heat. So if you do have energy recovery facilities, for example, that even now is can be quite competitive. Obviously, it doesn't apply everywhere, but where they exist, we should be making use of that waste heat and building networks off the back of them, and that sort of requires a certain amount of scale to do. And then and I think part of it is, as I mentioned before, is sort of comparing apples with apples. So making sure you're looking at the level of service that's being offered to the customer, is more than just the unit price of the heat, as we know, compared with the unit price of gas. So making sure that we're sort of making that point. Obviously, bringing in the carbon, as I think Paul said earlier, about better, low carbon being part of being better as well, and being able to sort of value that will be definitely be important. I'll let Chris go in, maybe come back.
Chris, you've seen a lot of projects. What's a common theme for the ones that are larger and more ambitious? If Rufus is saying make them as big as possible because that makes them as cheap as possible per connection or per kilowatt hour, what's a theme running through the bigger ones?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and just picking up on Amy and Paul's point around, where historically we've done a lot of the work that we've supported over the last 5 years, kind of rightly or wrongly, has looked at 10, 20, up to 50 buildings, but not kind of done the level of work in terms of, I think there's 1,300 properties that you've got on your map for Heat Vision 2030. So I think historically we've kind of, we know how to do the analysis at a project level, and we're starting to, with the use of tools and kind of algorithms, to be able to do the same level of analysis at a city level. We then need to obviously step out of that detail, and I think one of the key things for us is kind of communicating the benefits to relevant stakeholders. So it's all good and well kind of producing a 100-page report that they might like to see, or some of us on the call might like to see, but if you're a customer of heat, you probably just want a one-pager saying, this is what it provides for me, this is the benefit, these are the kind of expectations that would be placed on me, this is when it's going to happen, and this is the cost. So I think that communication piece is key. In terms of what we can do, just repeating some of the things that Rufus has said around utilising low-cost waste heat, doing things at scale. So does the 250 million identified here enable GE to kind of purchase pipes at bulk or move factories to the UK if it's even bigger? you would automatically knock 20% off the cost just by transporting it over on a lorry over to the UK. So, and then there's lots of ancillary things around, business rates, tariffs, VAT, and a key one, Dave, you mentioned at the top, is electricity input function. So if we're able to kind of use and optimize thermal storage, we can kind of change when we purchase electricity at different times of day. So we've got a big piece of work we're looking at trying to kind of almost create a kind of seasonal time of day tariff for large heat network projects across the UK. So yeah, lots of different things you can do. None are particularly straightforward, and I think there will be different kind of instances of those things that will work in different cities in the UK.
Okay, just thinking forward a little bit towards supply chain. It's really a question. I guess anybody can answer on this, but Amy probably has the broadest view of the sort of people that are members of the ADE so far. But I mean, what does the supply chain look like? Are they ready? What do they need to do to move into this from district heating into clean 2050 ready district heating? What are they waiting for? Why isn't this stuff just flying already? What needs to click?
I think the supply chains are in place, and I think largely they are ready to deliver, and we have projects like theoretical projects like the Heat Vision 2030 that show what can be done, and we've also got other projects in the UK that are energy from waste and really innovative heat networks in the ground already. I think the kind of regulatory, obviously this year both in in 21, in Scotland and in the UK, we'll see much wider heat network regulation, and that will kind of influence the growth of the sector, and we're working on that, supporting the sector. I think there are definitely gaps in terms of the skills needed to deliver on heat network ambition and what we have currently and what we need to scale up heat networks in city centres. Specifically, there was a report earlier this year, the Heat Network Skills in Scotland report by Energy Savings Trust, that kind of identified a skills gap in terms of capacity needed to deliver Scottish ambition on heat networks, specifically around designing and installing heat networks, technologies such as heat pump, thermal storage, but also the kind of softer skills around project management and administration and finance as well. On the flip side of that report did actually pick out some institutions in and around Glasgow that have the capacity to have their existing curriculums adapted to deliver heat network specific skills. So Glasgow Kelvin College was one, South Lanarkshire College was another, and also Glasgow Caledonian University were all identified in that report as being places where there were either heat networks in situ or nearby that students could kind of go and learn from. And I think that's a really big opportunity for the Glasgow area to capitalise on local skills and build those local supply chains and keep the kind of wider socioeconomic benefits local to the area. And the Scottish Government and the UK Government have really thrown their weight behind green recovery and creating green jobs. And if the heat network sector can step up and say, look, we are delivering these jobs and we're investing in skills and we're collaborating with HEFE and industry, then now's the time to do it.
So just before anyone else sort of jumps in that, what I'm not hearing though is that these are super duper long training program, 10 years in training, brain surgeon type jobs. It's stuff that we can get in amongst straight away. It's pipes in the ground largely, and building connections and welders, and I'm thinking about as one industry grows, another one's perhaps shrinking a little bit in terms of offshore welding and that type of thing. So it's as much about redeployment of skills surely as inventing brand new skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are examples I don't know if anyone's heard of the Heat Academy initiative that was set up with Stoke-on-Trent College in 2014, and they are now working with workers in Bridgend to kind of reskill from heavy industry and get them into lower carbon industries and green jobs. So yeah, there are examples of where that's been done before, and there's no reason that Glasgow and Scotland more widely can't do that.
Slightly conscious of time, if anybody's got a particularly burning issue on the skills, but one last question I really kind of wanted to ask everybody was really about the sort of the skills can come, and it's not going to be through the planning piece, and it needs to be investable, and the bigger the better. The other themes we've kind of picked up on already, but how would you wrap all that together in terms of a takeaway and the levers that need to be pulled? If you could, in one sentence each, sum up of, if you were king or queen for the day, what magic pen legislation would you write to just get this thing moving along the path that we know is possible? In no particular order, but all take a shot.
I don't mind going first and saying something. I mean,
well, Paul started. On you go, Paul.
It's not quite one magic bullet, but I think I think what we need is to get things happening on the ground and to have an overarching strategic vision of what we want to achieve. I don't think panicking is going to help us. We need to make some really good but bold decisions. And it doesn't take long to do that. I don't think it takes long to do that strategic work. But at the moment, it's missing in many cities, and we have to have that work done so that we've got the direction of travel and we've got a path to follow. It is going to require a bit of patience, and that's difficult when we've got the burning platform that we have. But it does require a bit of patience. But we've got to move quickly on getting the sort of strategic plans in place and the low regrets solutions started and on the ground.
I'll jump in. I think. I was going to say about sort of coordination. So we at the moment we still have kind of different things not all pulling in exactly the same direction. So making sure that business rates and funding and building regs and all of that all align and sort of drive towards the same sort of policy goal that we're aiming for. And I think heat zoning we're really excited about is a vehicle to kind of enable that at local level, that sort of coordination of pulling everything together at the same time. I think you definitely need the vision, as Paul says, and then I'd add to that and say as well, you just also got to get started. And our experience in other markets, and particularly Amsterdam, which is quite similar to the UK in some ways in terms of gas dependence and so on, where we've really seen that over 20 years there building out a heat network. Although it starts with a new build, once you've got pipes in the ground, people become interested in connecting up, and the thing grows over time and shifts towards retrofit of existing buildings. So I think you combine that vision with a starting point and the coordination, and then things will start to move.
Shall I go next? One sentence. I would say to get the traction that we need to bring forward the scalable, replicable, at speed proposition for the market, regulators, planners to see what it is we're talking about. But that has to be done using a whole systems approach. So it goes beyond heat. It thinks of the different elements that make up that whole systems approach and delivers that exciting, ambitious, innovative proposition to the market.
Sorry, Chris, do you want to throw anything in?
I guess the key word for me is coordination. So whether that be stakeholders, energy vectors, local government versus national government, all sorts of coordination across all different types of stakeholders. And I think the one key thing I'd point out, and a distinction which is becoming very apparent as part of our kind of early engagement on the zoning consultation, which will be consulted on in spring next year, is, without that local coordination, there will probably be more individual building solutions, regardless of whether they're more efficient or less efficient than a network solution. And it's only with that kind of coordination will we actually, realise some of the kind of strategic heat decarbonisation efficiencies, if you like, that we talk about. So coordination is the key point.
Thanks, Chris. So Amy, last word to you in this segment, and then we'll go back to that poll question questions we teased. But what if you could write any piece of driving policy, what would it say?
I think my take-home point would be that there are no silver bullet solutions for this, and that heat is a local proposition. It will vary by area, and the areas that can get going on heat decarbonisation and installing heat networks, getting those connections in place, need to do so. And it will take collaboration. It will take supportive regulation, but equally, everybody needs heat. Heat's a non-negotiable, but equally getting to net zero is a non-negotiable as well. And we need to make those things match up, and we need to make it palatable. So I think that would be mine. Okay. Ben, if you're still there, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the poll, and we've got quite a few questions come in that we'll pitch to the assembled. But if we go for the poll, first of all, if you want to manage that, Ben, please.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I'll there's a few questions. I'll put one at a time, and if we could try and answer them relatively quickly, and we'll be able to get through them all. Here's the first one.
Are you going to whistle the countdown theme tune?
Da, 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 da. Okay. Right. Should buildings and heat networks be obligated to reduce fossil fuel emissions, or if they prefer, join a heat network? So it's yes, one of those two things, or no, neither of those two things. Yeah, we've had some really good questions come through as well. So yeah, you can vote, and if you've got any other questions that you'd like to put forward, please send them through. I've tried to answer a few just broadly, and if we don't get to all of them, we can always try and follow up afterwards. Okay, I'm going to close that one. Next one. There we go. And so yeah, 89% in favor of, 11% not in favor of. Okay. Next one. Okay, so as to maximize the viability of heat networks, should all buildings in a zone be obligated to draw heat from a heat network? So we had a number of different points there, possibly a bit tricky to obligate people, but should they be? How is perhaps one of the questions that we need to answer. We can always share the results of all of these polls, if you wish to have a copy of them. We can always share them with you once we collect them all. Okay, so I'm gonna close that down now and share. Okie dokie. Yeah, so much more split down the middle. Looks a bit like a dead heat, really, more or less. Okay, so that's clearly a more difficult one to. Okay, the third question. To drive down fossil fuel emissions, should clean air zones be declared in all city centres? So I guess we're talking about things like the low emission zones, such as we have certainly in the city centre of London. That's the ultra low emission zone they've got there now. Should that sort of policy be used? And these are as a specific action that is reserved for local authorities, city authorities. Okay, I'm gonna call this one. Anyone else want to click? Okie dokie. So yeah, pretty strong well, almost 100% consensus there. 95% in favour of giving cities or asking cities to do that. Okay, number 4. The climate change levy on gas already exists. Should the revenues be used to fund zero carbon solutions? As we talked about earlier on today, the success of decarbonising electricity by supporting the wind and the solar industries was very successful, and that was essentially through money that was charged on to the price of electricity. So a similar kind of structure. Okay, anyone any more for any more? Okie dokie. Right. Yeah, pretty uncontroversial. But certainly, yeah, a big number of people believe that would make a lot of sense. Okay, the penultimate question then. Should buildings that join a low carbon heat network be exempt from paying the climate change levy? Maybe people would be in favour of being obligated to join heat networks if they knew that they would then not have to pay the climate change levy. I'm not sure how that works. But. Okay. Okay, yeah, I think most people have voted. I'll share that now. Okay, yeah, so 2/3 in favour and 1/3 don't believe that that these buildings should be exempt. And the final question, thanks very much for helping us out with this. It's great to hear what your thoughts are, and it gives us something that we can, yeah, sort of study and work and think about going forward. Do you think it is realistic to achieve net zero carbon emissions while allowing buildings to still burn gas? And by gas, we mean natural gas. All these answers and this feedback helps us think about, you know, what sort of themes and what that vision that we're trying to build, share, will actually look like. So. Okay. Okay, pretty strong majority in this one. I'm going to close this one now. Yeah, so 89% believe that we can't carry on burning gas in any way, shape or form. for buildings if we want to achieve net zero. Okay, so there's your polls. You got a bit of a feel for how people and what our audience are thinking. Should we go to questions? Okay, yeah. I've got a few questions here. I think there was an interesting point made by S. Moore. Thanks very much for that. You're essentially just referring to the fact that certainly in the last 5 years, there's been a real switch, if we look back over the course of the last 5 years, in terms of what people think about climate change and what needs to be done, decarbonisation. And you make a point that the key barriers to achieve clean heat include long-term funding, skills, limited coordination, international good practice, best practice sharing, regulation. And this is going forward. This is in hand going forward. But your key question is for the panel: where does the panel want to see more collaboration in the next years? Where should we see more collaboration? Anyone want to pick up on that one?
I can jump in. I think there's room for collaboration across city planners, the industry that delivers the solutions, the technical solutions, finance, and communities. I think we've got to understand what the vision is, how it's delivered, but then we've got to actually deliver it. So that delivery piece is really important. But we've also got to take people with us on the journey, whether that's domestic, non-domestic. So I think that's where the collaboration is or should be to really get to net zero as quickly as we can. It's challenging to change away from a nice cheap fuel, but we all say it now, we've all voted. So it's clear that there's an appetite for this, and there's a societal kind of paramount importance to deliver it. So yeah, that's where I see it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we as the AD would see a lot more collaboration across players kind of within the energy sector. So obviously the AD membership is a relatively broad church, but we're seeing collaboration between our demand side response members and our energy efficiency members to kind of realise flexibility, benefits of energy efficiency retrofit in homes. And I think the same could be said for those providing heat, and also the benefits of combining that with energy efficiency to realise kind of whole system benefits. So that's where we would see more collaboration being a good thing.
Cool. Another sort of theme within the questions is the idea of trust. We've talked about it during the session as well. How do we build up consumer trust? And I guess part of trust is ambition. If we trust it as a sector, we can grow our ambition as well. And then part of trust is being able to share pricing and being able to compare heat pricing with gas pricing and let people kind of understand where those two numbers lie. John O'Shea asks whether there are any plans for the UK to publish their heat prices like they do in Scandinavia, and maybe just more broadly, do we have other suggestions, or has anyone seen other examples? That's another question. Do we have examples here in the UK or more broadly that help demonstrate how we can build up trust?
I can say something on that. I mean, we've just been looking at the those numbers that John refers to in terms of the Danish prices, and yeah, it's a characteristic S curve that shows a small number of the heat networks in Denmark sell heat at a very low price. The majority of them sell them at a sort of middle of the road price, and some sell them at a higher price. That middle of the road price is pretty much equates to the Danish gas prices, slightly discounted against the Danish gas prices, but that is in a world where the Danish gas prices have got over 50% of their cost is paid in tax and environmental obligations. So so we didn't have that situation. You know, the basic cost of gas in Denmark and the basic cost of gas in the UK is pretty much the same. The tax on top of that is 5% in the UK and, well, more than 100% in Denmark. But that is a sort of compelling argument as to why you would connect to district heating in Denmark, and if I'm honest, why you wouldn't in the UK. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a point on transparency that'd be really helpful. I think publishing that information would be enormously useful. But I would also say that there's a level of greater transparency needed in gas price in the UK. If you go home and look at your gas bill, it will have two figures on it. It'll have a standing charge and a unit price for the gas you consume. If you can work out what goes into those two costs and how they're built up, then you know you've done better than me, because I've been looking at it for the last 2 weeks and I can't work it out.
I think I'd link this back a little bit to the previous question as well, because I think you know, historically heat networks have been sort of quite, you know, or certainly ESCO delivered heat networks anyway, often new builds in sort of fairly small vertically integrated systems. And what we're talking about is delivering city scale systems. And to do that, it's clear that people are going to have to work together. And I mentioned a couple of examples. You know, we're seeing that collaboration with sources of heat, with developers, you know, bringing groups of people together to make that work is going to be essential. And I think when you start to do that, you also move a bit towards, you know, a less vertically integrated model where you could potentially have a bit of competition amongst heat sources supplying into a heat network, for example, which would also, you know, that would then flow into a bit of a more sort of open model, and maybe a bit more transparency on the pricing as well. And I think actually just by the nature of having more people involved in a system as well, it sort of makes it easier to trust, because it's not all wrapped up in one organization that sort of controls everything.
Yeah. Another thing that people are talking and asking questions about is this, you know, is carbon tax and the climate change levy. Is it possible to apply a sufficiently large carbon tax for heat to be competitive with gas? Is that the right way to think about it? Or are there other ways that we should be thinking about how to deliver heat, and what we should be, you know, considering the realities of delivering, you know, heat at a price that is fair, even if it's perhaps not as cheap as gas? Does anyone have any thoughts about carbon tax on the one hand, and also sort of kind of another point of view that's being expressed is different types of heat networks that aren't just about heat, you know, 5G, cooling, you know, hydrogen. So you've got these different ways of doing heat network, as well as you've got you know, the specific carbon tax question. Does anyone have a feeling about that?
I'll say something on that, Ben. I mean, it ties in with another couple of questions about the heat pump and the capacity of it. Very quickly, what we've modelled here utilises probably about 20% of the heat that's available just from the flow rate of the River Clyde. Of course, the city centre area is actually tidal, so it's the tide washing in and out. So in terms of heat capacity of what we're taking, it's a tiny amount. The second question was about the environmental aspects. Our forefathers have been pumping water out of rivers for 100 years and longer for a variety of different purposes. Protecting aquatic life is a relatively simple thing to do. The temperature change that's affected from this, although the portion that goes through the heat pump is cooled by 3 degrees, when that's mixed back in, it's probably 0.03 degrees. So it's a tiny portion of the heat capacity. Going back to the sort of other opportunities of heat around about Glasgow, the simple reason that we focused on the river is that the investability. It's there, it's measurable, you can see it, you can touch it, you can measure it. The civil engineering required for pumping water at a river is very, very low. So there's other sources of heat around. You know, lots of different sources. Waste heat, mine water heat is a very topical one. It's all about what's easiest and start with that. There are areas of the country much further away from the coastal regions that definitely need to be more inventive, and I fully support research going on in these areas, but go for the easy stuff first. The Clyde is there, it's filling up as we speak. The rain's bashing off my window. It's going to run down the hill and fill up the Clyde. So it's kind of focusing on the easy stuff is probably the and make sure it's scalable. That's the way I'd answer those two questions.
Thanks, Dave. Listen, we're coming up for time. Chris, can you come in? You were wanting to put some thoughts to that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I can't comment specifically on carbon taxes, but I would point you to a consultation in September called Green Gas Levy. So if you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. And I think on the 3rd or 4th page, there's a really neat graph which basically shows the industrial and domestic gas prices in the UK compared to 15 other countries in Europe. So it kind of summarises what Paul was stating around the pence per kilowatt hour and the kind of tax and environmental obligations and levies in there. So it recognises the problem. There are some things in that consultation about how that could be addressed. Certainly from a kind of project level, a lot of our kind of conversation and work with consultants, local authorities and industries around kind of the difference between the gas and electricity price. And as I said, you know, there are some things which are kind of outside of our control at the moment, but there are also some things that we can do. So yeah, looking at maximising low cost input electricity could be one. Looking at where some of those taxes and environmental obligations already baked into the kind of gas and electricity are essentially being double paid on some heat network projects, if you like, is another area, but I'm sure there's others as well.
Okay, listen, I think we're almost hitting our time. There's still lots more questions that haven't been answered, and I haven't been able to digest it, and they're all really good questions. So all I can say is I'll have a look at them. I'll share them, you know, to the group and to the other members of Heat Vision 2030. Thanks ever so much for taking part. I'll pass over to you, Dave, and you know, if anyone else wants to put in some final comments.
It's only to say we can circulate the questions and then publish them onto the website in a sort of a link or something, some shape or fashion. I mean, this is all about having a go, taking stock, sharing ideas, sharing observations, and trying to throw in ideas of how to make it better. This is by no means finished. It's hardly even started, and that's why I'm so pleased. And I'll say my thanks to all the panelists for joining us and sharing their insights. Thanks to the audience for tuning in, and you know, those that ask questions, thank you. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, but for me, I'll say thank you very much just now, but there's still a few minutes if anybody's got any sort of final topping and tailing thoughts on the subject. How do we take it forwards? That's my question.
Chris or anyone?
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation as to how we take it forward. So the reason I've kind of been following the previous webinars on Heat Vision 2030 for some time, and been having conversations with the team in the background. I think what's really interesting, and as others have kind of stated, is, you know, we can continue kind of doing 10, 20, 50 buildings at a time. But I think now we start to have the kind of tools and ability to kind of do some of that kind of analysis at a city level. Analysis is just the very, very first part. I mean, we need to kind of dive out of the detail once all of that's been done and be able to communicate it. But yeah, really keen to keep working with the project. It kind of ties in with what we're doing on zoning. We will be engaging with a club, but we will be engaging with a lot of you, and we already have them actually started to before the spring. If anyone wants to have a kind of detailed conversation around zoning or give us any thoughts, and yeah, how it pertains to Heat Vision 2030 as well. It's you know, a little bit of the same thing. Then please get in touch.
Thanks, Chris. Next, was that Roddy? Are you making a?
Well, yeah, I would just like to say thanks to you folk for, you know, bringing forward the idea and having the passion and vision to have a go, as Dave says, because we need people that have got drive and initiative and, you know, move us forward, because that's what that's the only way we're going to tackle this challenge. And yeah, so all power to your elbow and keep it up.
Thanks, Roddy. Jolly good. Okay. Anyone else, Paul?
Yeah, no, I was going to echo what Roddy says. I mean, it's great that this challenge has been laid down, and I think yeah, I'm keen to continue the conversation with you and to look at where's the next city. Let's have a go at a few of them.
Yeah, there's a lot of cities out there, aren't there?
There are.
There are.
Plenty of places to play.
Listen, indeed. So if you, all of you who are here, you know, that's an open invitation to anyone. If you want to get in touch and discuss what we're doing at Heat Vision 2030, then please do. You'll find all our details on the website. Anyone else, Rufus or Amy?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I'd echo what Paul and Roddy are saying as well. And I mean, I would say that we, you know, we are moving forward. Actually, we need to move forward quicker and in more places all at once. So yeah, and I think you know, I think it's quite exciting. I think having that vision, and then you know, it's that scale thing, isn't it? I think it's moving from doing projects maybe to kind of forming businesses in cities that grow, and you know, it's part of the network and the assets, and then that's what will bring the supply chain through that we were talking about earlier and all of that. So yeah, so I think there's a good opportunity here. We need to align everything to do it, but yeah, we just need to build on the start that we have and accelerate it rapidly.
What was it? What did you say to me the other day there, Dave? Eat, sleep, heat, repeat, or something like that. What was that? Amy, anything else from you?
Yeah, just to echo everyone else, really. I think 2021 is going to be a really big year for heat networks. Obviously, we're seeing regulation coming in Scotland and the wider UK, and hopefully frameworks that will be supportive of all of this work. And I think it's just great to see projects like this coming forward. And with COP26 being in Glasgow, it would be fantastic to have this as a case study of what could be done, and you know, scale that out across the UK.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Actually, certainly it motivates me. We've got COP26 in a year's time. What do we want to say to the world, and what do we want to say that we can do, right? So that's what we want to try and that's where we want to be.
Yeah, for me, it's the COP of getting stuff done. It's time to start doing what we know is possible. We can finesse and tweak and build on it as we go forwards, 5 years, 10 years from now, but every year counts.
All right then. Well, listen, thanks once again to everybody. We shall be in touch in one way, shape or form, no doubt. Take care, keep well, and see you the next time.
Thanks, Ben. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye.
Thanks.